Welcome to Music Theory Logic. Andrew here, and today I wanted to talk about practice. And practice is something that most musicians like myself do. My main instrument that I've worked the hardest on throughout my lifetime is guitar playing. I play a ton of piano and practice piano and have practiced at time periods, but guitar is really the thing that I'm drawn to the most. I'll speak to specifically like why or the merits of either. It doesn't really matter for this video, but my practice, my philosophy can be broken into what follows, and I think any of you out there, regardless of what instrument you're playing, can use this to get a lot better at your instrument. And for me, this wasn't something that an instructor really like laid out for me, and it wasn't something I read in a book, and it really is just from my own trial and error through years and years of playing. So I like to break up my practice into 4 different categories. The first category is technique. The second category is repertoire, or the music that I can play. The third category is ear training. And the fourth category is creativity, or songwriting, or putting the music playing into use in a different way or with notes that you haven't played or practiced specifically. So I'll typically try to like give an even time distribution to those. So if I'm going to play for 20 minutes, or somebody asks me like, if I'm practicing for 20 minutes, what should I do? So 5 minutes for each of those 4. Technique, that is going to be the sort of mechanics of your instrument. Everything from scales to chords to arpeggios to riffs or patterns within scales, sequences in scales. And the biggest thing that will help tighten up the technique on all those things I just mentioned is to incorporate a metronome into your practice. Now, a metronome is a steady, perfectly like robotic click. We measure it in beats per minute. The one benefit for every musician, if you ultimately end up recording in the modern world, at some point you will have to record to a click track. For musicians that don't practice or don't play with metronomes, that can be really a difficult thing to play with and feel natural at the same time. Playing with metronome really helps with that. And then if you want to play fast, whatever instrument, the harder things, playing with speed is typically like a difficult thing to do. And one of the things about playing fast, especially when you're first starting to play fast, whether you realize it or not, certain parts of the phrase of the scale or certain parts that you're playing are going to be less solid than other parts, or you're going to be rushing, or you're going to notice that that's where you make mistakes more often. Playing with the metronome will really highlight those sections. It'll allow you to practice those parts of whatever you're playing, and it will make it so you're not rushing at any point of that phrase. And ultimately, it will allow you to play faster than you may think is possible. And on a side note, something in sort of like rock and roll or like popular music that a lot of musicians throughout time haven't thought it's like really cool to talk about practicing. Luckily, we are way past that, and some of my greatest favorite guitar players and some of the greatest guitar players on the planet, like Buckethead, although he hasn't done as much speaking, or Steve Vai or Paul Gilbert or Yngwie Malmsteen, also not as much speaking on practice, but Steve Vai and Paul Gilbert are obviously not just like rippers, can play some of the craziest stuff on the guitar that anyone has ever played, but they are also obsessed with the instrument and can play like that in part because of natural ability. They're both big guys, big reaches on their hands, but they've also worked super hard at their playing, and that has to have something to do with how they can play. But technique, everyone that plays fast has at one point or another worked with the metronome, and that is just, there's no getting around it. So warm up 5 minutes on a metronome, pick a scale shape or something specific, and try to practice it to the metronome. Next, repertoire. So fancy way of saying music that you play, music that you've learned. If you're playing whatever instrument you're playing, you perhaps have favorite songs in that style. Some of those songs you perhaps know how to play or know how to play parts of, or maybe you've taken lessons and you have some songs you can play through. Take the next 5 minutes and play through those songs. I think it's important to vary which songs that you play that of the ones when you're practicing, because we want to keep this fresh. We don't want to fall into the trap of just doing literally the same thing each time, because it'll get stale. You'll stop seeing benefits. Um, so play a piece of music that you know how to play or are working on playing. Spend 5 minutes to that. The next one is the one that is the most left out and is something that I didn't really like actively try to practice in the beginning, and that is ear training. And the simplest way that you can practice ear training is to pick a song where you can find a recording of somebody playing the instrument you're learning or practicing or play, and try to figure out what they're playing without any notation. So don't look up a tab if you're playing guitar. Literally just noodle around on the instrument until you find the pitch that matches what you hear. Keep playing the recording till you get the various pitches in a row, and then try to mimic the recording. Now, on a side note, I think this is a really overlooked thing in modern musicianship, and the reason for that is that notation is just so accessible. Any song that you fill in famous band played, if they're truly a huge famous band, there are lots of different options and definitely notation for most of their songs available. So it's possible to play at a really high level and to never really do any ear training, to just look at notation and to play that. And I think that you just miss out on a lot of that if you're not working on your ear training. And so on a side note, the musicians that I really looked up to, like the early rock and roll players or musicians like, I don't know, Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones, or Eric Clapton. He was like hugely inspirational to me in guitar playing in the beginning. And when you look into how those musicians of that era learned music, because of just the nature of the time period, they were playing records that they liked, and then they were trying to mimic what they heard on the record with their instrument. It was, I'm sure, difficult. I'm sure it took a lot of time. But the amazing thing that they got out of doing that was to understand the music that they liked and to understand their instrument in a different way than just looking at notation and understanding where to put our fingers because the piece of paper or someone else's score tells us to. Now, ear training, like all of the other, is going to benefit other skills. So the better your ear training is, the better you can write a melody. If you're jamming or you're playing along with a band or a backing track, you can hear what they're doing, understand on some level the chord progression and the things they're doing, and then you can figure out something to play on top of that. Again, from ear training, if we're talking repertoire and we're playing a song and we know the section that we just don't do, like the recording, the better our ear training gets, the better capable we are to recognize why that is. So finally, the last of those 4 sections was creativity. And I think creativity, regardless of whether you're a musician or you create something else, I think working or practicing creativity is a really difficult thing to do. There's just something about being creative that, like, sometimes it works and you're happy with what you wrote, and sometimes it doesn't. And it's hard to understand why that happens. But there's a lot of great resources on creativity. And the thing that, for me, that's really helped is to do the work, to not expect that I'm going to get something that I'm incredibly proud of, that it's like the greatest thing that I ever wrote or anything like that. But I try to just take the time to let what's going to happen. So certain things you can do as creative portion of your practice on an instrument is to play with the backing track. Put the track on, it'll tell you what key it's in, right? And then just play, just get creative, forget about the rules and everything else, and just play. Another great way of getting creative is to literally not have anything other than your instrument turned on if it's electronic, or your instrument with you, and try to create something, try to make something. And the more you do that, the more you can put yourself into a state of mind that is getting creative, and ultimately those are the ways that you can ultimately create music, or to um, is to better understand your music. It's important to say that, like, even if you're studying violin and you are just trying to, not just, but you are solely focused on playing classical violin and ideally obtaining a symphony seat in the future, I think getting creative and like trying to write stuff helps us to better understand the music that we're playing from other people that wrote the music, and for that reason it is super helpful. So when you're learning an instrument and your instructor, somebody tells you, your parent tells you have to practice, it can be really difficult to know what to practice. Hopefully this helps you think about what you're playing or where you're at with your playing, and those four categories: your technique, the songs you know how to play, the ear training, and finally the creative element. And try to separate your practice up into equal sections. It's not about how long we do it, but it's about the consistency and the repetition. And then finally, my last tip for you is that it can be really helpful to have many options for each of those categories to practice. And for who I am and how I respond to practicing this stuff, it's helped me out a lot to, let's say, have like 20 techniques that I'm working on, and each day I might only practice like two of them, but it'll be like a different two each day. Helps me not get burned out, and I think it also helps improve in a way that it's kind of strange. You would think if you want to get better at like this, you should just do that. But in music, sometimes if you want to get better at this, if you do some of that, somehow circles back and makes you better at that initial thing faster than if you had just solely focused on that thing. So anyway, hopefully this was helpful for you. If you're out there and you are an aspiring music producer, or you're just curious about some of my other content and you're not actually practicing an instrument, that's totally fine. It's never too late to start playing an instrument, and I think that it can only help you in whatever musical endeavors that you have. If you found this helpful, you would help me out a lot by subscribing to the channel. I will see you next time. Thank you for hanging out with me. Once again, I'm Andrew, and this is Music Theory Logic. Cheers.